you curious about reading Shakespeare's plays, but maybe you haven't touched them since high school and you're not sure where to start? One good place to start might be thinking about what kind of books you like to read just in general for fun, or even what kind of movies you like to watch, or what kind of TV shows you enjoy. So today, what I'm going to be doing is giving my advice for which Shakespeare play to read based on your favorite modern genres. I have read a lot of Shakespeare's plays. I've not read all of them, but I think I'm at about 2/3 now, so, good sampling of the different types of plays that he wrote, and hopefully I'll be able to use that to help you find which one you want to read. I was not able to find one for every genre. Like, for instance, there's really nothing in Shakespeare that makes me think, oh, I bet a sci-fi fan would like this. Sci-fi wasn't a thing back in Shakespeare's time. But I was able to find something for fantasy. Actually, 2 of Shakespeare's plays are pretty much in the fantasy genre. They're not the traditional high fantasy with elves and kings and great battles between good and evil, but as far as including supernatural elements and magic, they definitely do. Those are A Midsummer Night's Dream and The Tempest. A Midsummer Night's Dream takes place in ancient Athens, theoretically, but it's really not anything like ancient Athens at all. And it involves a love quadrilateral that gets really complicated with the addition of some love potion and a group of fairies living in the woods. When I say fairies, I don't mean like Tinkerbell. I mean like old-fashioned, kind of powerful and a little bit scary, mischievous, can't really be trusted, meddling in the lives of mortals, that kind of fairies. The kind that they, used to believe in back before Disney got involved. And then The Tempest, the main character is actually a wizard. And that's a big part of the play, the ways that he uses magic to kind of manipulate the circumstances around him. So if you like the fantasy genre and you're looking for something that has a little bit of the supernatural in it, try The Tempest or A Midsummer Night's Dream. Another really obvious connection that I was able to make was between the modern horror genre and the play Macbeth. Now, Macbeth is not a horror movie the way that you might be familiar with nowadays, but it does involve some supernatural aspects that make the story really creepy, and definitely there's a lot going on there that's pretty dark and disturbing. There are these 3 witches that show up that make a prophecy that Macbeth will become king, and then he tells his wife, and his wife is like, that prophecy could come true really easily one particular way, which is to kill the king and then become the new king. And so that's what Macbeth does. And that decision haunts him for the rest of the play. I think that if you like horror stories in the present day, you like things that are dark and creepy and don't mind a little bit of bloodshed, you might like Macbeth. Another popular genre nowadays is the dystopian genre. If you like dystopian novels, you might like Richard III. Richard III is very loosely based on real British history and the historical British monarch Richard III, who in Shakespeare's play is portrayed as a very cruel and manipulative guy who takes the throne via not so ethical means and basically is destroying the kingdom. And there are a lot of other characters that end up either working with him but then being stabbed in the back, or working against him, or whatever the case may be. So I think if you like the dystopian genre, you probably like the idea of your characters being heroes that are rebelling against corrupt authority figures, and you definitely get that in Richard III. If you like the romance genre, romance novels, romantic comedies, things like that, you might like Much Ado About Nothing. Much Ado About Nothing is very similar in a lot of ways to modern romantic comedies. The main couple, Beatrice and Benedict, they don't get along at the beginning. But despite their arguments, it turns out via a series of comedic misunderstandings and revelations that they actually have very strong feelings for each other, which get further complicated by other things that happen later in the story, but ultimately lead to a happy ending. So in that way, it's very similar to the way that romance often plays out in modern storytelling. If you like historical fiction, well, you're in luck, because everything that Shakespeare wrote takes place in the past. But I actually have a couple of recommendations for where to start in terms of historical fiction that's based on actual historical events. Because, sure, Romeo and Juliet takes place in medieval Italy, but the point of it isn't what was going on in medieval Italy. It's the story of the two lovers. Whereas if you read something like any of the British history plays or the ancient Roman plays, you'll find that they're actually focused around real historical events, very heavily fictionalized versions of real historical events, but historical events nonetheless. If you like the mystery genre, I actually have 3 recommendations for you. But keep in mind, they're not actually mysteries. Shakespeare didn't write mysteries the way that we know them, where there's, a detective character who's investigating a crime and a series of clues that are hidden and a big twist at the end as far as who did it. There really wasn't any such thing in Shakespeare's day. However, I've noticed that mysteries often explore kind of the darker side of human nature and why people do terrible things. And so, if that's something that appeals to you about mysteries, you might like Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar is the story of the historical assassination of Julius Caesar. And it follows the 2 characters that kind of are the ringleaders of the group that conspires to assassinate him. So you get to see what they're planning, their reasoning behind it, their kind of reactions in the aftermath of it, and what they do afterwards. And I think you kind of get that, you don't get the whodunit aspect, but you get the but why did they do it thing. Similarly, there's something that goes on that's very much like that in Othello, where throughout the play, you see the way that Iago is manipulating Othello, you see the way that his jealousy kind of builds up, and the way that it eventually plays out, even though there's never any question of who is doing what, there is kind of a complicated mystery in all of the pieces that are put into place by Iago to frame Desdemona for cheating on him. It's those are things that you could see in a mystery novel, that the detective could pick up on the fact that, somebody else having Desdemona's handkerchief, you would think that would mean that she's cheating, but actually this clue, that clue, and the other thing, deduction, Iago did it. That's the sort of thing that I could totally see Sherlock Holmes or Hercule Poirot figuring out. So that kind of complex series of events, if you like that, you might like Othello. And then finally, Hamlet. Hamlet is probably the closest to a murder mystery that actually exists in Shakespeare, with Hamlet as the detective character. Because his father's ghost tells him that King Claudius murdered him, but he doesn't actually have any evidence. He's very skeptical about what his father's ghost says, because he's not sure if it's really his father's ghost or just, a hallucination or a deception of some kind. So, he goes about investigating. He puts on a play and it basically mimics the circumstances of his father's death if his father's ghost was telling the truth, and he watches Claudius's reaction. And that kind of snooping around to figure out what happened and making sure to put all the pieces together before acting. It doesn't work so well for Hamlet, but it sure does work for Sherlock Holmes. Finally, you'll probably notice that when I said if you like romance, I did not recommend Romeo and Juliet. And the reason for that is that it's not a romance by modern standards. Don't get me wrong, it's a love story. But romance in the modern day implies a lot of things, one of which is a happy ending. Romeo and Juliet does not have a happy ending. So I wouldn't recommend that if you like romance. But if you like young adult, you might like Romeo and Juliet. The reason that I say that is because the characters are in fact teenagers. And so, if you like young adult, I'm assuming that either you are a teenager or you don't mind reading about teenagers. And that would also probably tell me that the weird, reckless things that teenagers do because they're teenagers and they haven't learned better yet, that wouldn't bother you too much. That's basically what Romeo and Juliet is. It's the story of 2 teenagers who are acting very much like teenagers, and it all ends very tragically. So that's one that I'm actually a little bit hesitant to recommend just because it's so contrary to our modern expectations of what a romance is. But I think that I would recommend it if you like young adult just because it does feature teenagers acting like teenagers. Although keep in mind, young adult novels nowadays also often have a happy ending, and don't expect that. Anyway, I hope that you found this video helpful, and I hope that you find a Shakespeare play to read. If you liked this and you would like to see more from me, feel free to subscribe. I post new videos every Monday and Thursday.